From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
My understanding is that there are UK and Canadian special forces already inside Iraq, so we'll be operating on a much smaller scale, but in an entirely comparable way to the United States Special Forces.
As Australia and Turkey join the U.S.-led fight against militants in Iraq and Syria, the United Nations reveals 26,000 civilians have been killed or injured so far this year in Iraq. We'll speak with Jeremy Scahill, author of Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield, about the crisis in the Middle East, Blackwater on trial, and more. Then to Iraq veterans against the war.
All of us who've come to Iraq Veterans Against the War, it's been because of something very personal. It's been because we've been transformed in our own lives. Each of our individual stories is crucially important and needs to be heard if people are to understand the reality and the true human cost of war and occupation.
10 years ago, a group of veterans came back from combat to form Iraq Veterans Against the War. A decade later, the group is now organizing against another war in Iraq. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Australia has become the latest country to join the U.S.-led military campaign against militants from the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Prime Minister Tony Abbott said Australian planes will take part in airstrikes and that special forces would be deployed in Iraq. Turkey's parliament has also backed the effort, authorizing the government to order military action against the militants. The news comes as Iraq's defense minister claimed Iraqi forces have made gains against ISIS, retaking 30 villages east of Baghdad. The United Nations has released a report detailing possible war crimes and an accelerating death toll in Iraq. Since January, more than 9,000 civilians have been killed, more than half of them since the ISIS offensive began in June. In total, at least 26,000 Iraqis have been killed or wounded this year. Rupert Colville, spokesperson for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, unveiled the report's findings.
This is really a devastating report. It covers just 9 weeks and such a huge array of appalling human rights abuses, mostly by ISIL. These include rape, they include murder, summary executions, sometimes of very large numbers of people, abductions, recruitment of children, making children into fighters, destruction of mosques, of churches, other religious buildings. It's a really devastating litany of horrendous abuses affecting many, many thousands of people.
While the UN report focused on ISIS militants, it also found Iraqi government airstrikes had caused significant civilian deaths, striking villages, hospitals, and a school in violation of international law. A U.S. Marine believed to have been lost at sea has become the first reported U.S. military casualty of the campaign against ISIS. The Marine and a colleague who survived both ejected from their aircraft after it briefly lost power over the Persian Gulf. Pro-democracy leaders in Hong Kong have agreed to talks with the city's top leader after days of mass protest. Leung Chun-ying has refused to step down despite vows by protesters to remain in the streets and occupy government buildings unless he does so. The protests erupted over China's plan to select candidates in Hong Kong's 2017 elections. Authorities are assessing 100 people who may have had contact with the first Ebola patient diagnosed in the United States. The partner of Thomas Eric Duncan, meanwhile, says she and 3 other family members have been quarantined in the apartment where Duncan was staying under threat of criminal charges if they leave. But the sheets and dirty towels used by Duncan remain inside the apartment, too, as authorities struggle to find a company willing and able to safely take them. Duncan was sent home from a Dallas hospital last week despite telling a nurse he'd been to Liberia. He was readmitted 4 days later. He came by ambulance. The hospital blamed a gap in its electronic record-keeping that prevented a doctor from seeing the nurse's note about Duncan's travels. Duncan's nephew, Joseph Weeks, told NBC he had personally called the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
I called CDC to get some actions taken because I was concerned for his life, and he wasn't getting the appropriate care. And I feared that other people might also get infected if he wasn't taken care of.
In Liberia, a freelance camera person who worked for NBC News has become the fourth American diagnosed with Ebola. Ashoka Mukpo will be flown to the United States for treatment. A federal appeals court has allowed Texas to immediately begin enforcing a sweeping anti-choice law, effectively gutting access to abortion overnight. 13 of the state's remaining abortion clinics have been forced to close, leaving Texas the second largest state with just 8 abortion facilities, all of them in 4 metropolitan areas. Nearly 1 million Texas women will now have to travel a minimum of 300 miles round trip to access abortion. The provision, which went into effect following Thursday's court ruling, requires all abortion clinics to meet hospital-style building requirements, reversing the order of a lower court judge who found the restrictions posed an undue burden. The lower judge had also allowed 2 clinics in Texas's isolated Rio Grande Valley to reopen after they and many other facilities in Texas were forced to close under a separate provision requiring hospital admitting privileges. But the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals also reversed that decision, shuttering the 2 clinics and leaving no abortion facilities west or south of San Antonio. The Rio Grande Valley is home to many undocumented immigrants who cannot travel north due to border checkpoints and are effectively cut off from legal abortion. In a statement, the Center for Reproductive Rights, which is fighting the law in court, said, quote, "All Texas women have been relegated today to a second class of citizens." In Oklahoma, one of just 3 abortion providers in the state is challenging a law requiring providers to obtain admitting privileges at a local hospital. Dr. Larry Burns says he's been unable to obtain privileges at any of 16 nearby hospitals after many refused to even process his application. In Alabama, the American Civil Liberties Union is suing to block a law they say could force minors seeking abortion to stand trial. The law applies to minors who cannot safely obtain parental consent for abortion, which is required in Alabama. It allows the court to appoint a guardian for the minor's fetus and would let that guardian, the district attorney, and potentially the minor's parents call witnesses to testify against the minor. Brazil is holding presidential elections Sunday. President Dilma Rousseff faces a challenge from Marina Silva, who served as environment minister under President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and became a candidate in August after her running mate died in a plane crash. Marina Silva grew up in the Amazon rainforest, fought its devastation alongside rubber tapper Chico Mendes. Her supporters say she would become the world's first green president, but critics worry that as an evangelical Christian, she would implement right-wing social policies. They also note her chosen running mate has ties to agribusiness. Tens of thousands marched in Mexico City Thursday to mark the anniversary of the Tlatelolco student massacre. On October 2, 1968, just days before Mexico City hosted the Olympics, government forces opened fire on students in the Plaza de las Tres Culturas, killing up to 350 people. To date, no one has been tried. The anniversary comes as more than 40 students remain missing in the Mexican state of Guerrero following an alleged police ambush last weekend. Witnesses say both police and unknown gunmen attacked buses carrying students from a rural teachers' college and players from a soccer club, killing 6 people, including 3 students and a 15-year-old boy. Enrique Espinosa, who survived the 1968 massacre, said the recent killings are part of a legacy of impunity in Mexico.
It seems that we are returning to the same things that happened in those years back in the 60s. Repression, political prisoners, persecutions, and injustices. A whole lot of injustices.
In Venezuela, a lawmaker in the ruling Socialist Party has been found murdered in his home, along with his partner. Robert Serra was the youngest member of Venezuela's Congress. The motive remains unclear, but Venezuela's justice minister said the killings were, quote, carried out with great precision. In the Gulf nation of Bahrain, the prominent human rights activist Nabil Rajab has been detained after posting tweets critical of the government. Rajab, who leads the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, was released from prison in May after serving 2 years for his role in pro-democracy protests against the U.S.-backed monarchy. In Colorado, the Jefferson County School Board has passed a proposal to institute a curriculum review committee despite protests by high school students and teachers. The committee will review district courses, adding material to, quote, promote citizenship, patriotism, essentials and benefits of the free market system, respect for authority, and respect for individual rights. Democracy Now! Asked the proposal's author, school board member Julie Williams, about the proposal's mention of obedience to authority.
You know, I took those lines out of the National Republican resolution as well as Texas because I thought that it was misunderstood. I just think that when we are teaching our students, it's not to suppress them. I want to teach them that our country is a great place to live.
J.P. Morgan Chase has disclosed one of the largest corporate data breaches in U.S. history. While the hack had been previously disclosed, prior estimates said only about 1 million accounts had been impacted. Now the bank says 76 million household accounts and 7 million small business accounts were compromised as hackers penetrated deep into its systems, gathering customers' names and contact information. The hack went undetected for 2 months. Thousands took to the streets to protest austerity and unemployment as the leaders of the European Central Bank met in Naples, Italy. Police fired tear gas and water cannons at demonstrators, while bank leaders voted to keep interest rates at a record low and announced plans to begin buying private sector assets later this month. In Missouri, the St. Louis County prosecutor is investigating a possible leak by the grand jury, considering whether to indict police officer Darren Wilson for the fatal shooting of Michael Brown. A tweet posted to the account of Susan Nichols read, quote, "I know someone sitting on the grand jury. There isn't enough at this point to warrant an arrest," she wrote. Grand jury deliberations are supposed to be secret. Nichols has claimed her account was hacked. A 79-year-old peace activist has been sentenced to 3 months in jail for protesting at a base in upstate New York where U.S. drones are piloted remotely. Jack Gilroy is among several activists to face trial in DeWitt Town Court for protesting at Hancock Air Base. He spoke before his sentencing on Wednesday.
We are killing people around the world, and our statement was to take a message, and that's going to be primarily what I'll be saying today. First Amendment right, the right to take a message and not to be killed because you're the messenger bringing in the information to stop the killing.
And the peace activist and author Fred Bronfman has died of ALS at the age of 72. Bronfman exposed the covert U.S. bombing of Laos in the 60s and 70s in what became the largest bombing campaign in history. The United States dropped more than 2 million tons of bombs on the small Southeast Asian country. Bronfman interviewed refugees and helped illuminate their plight for other journalists and activists, including world-renowned linguist Noam Chomsky, who traveled to Laos in 1970. Speaking at Harvard University last year, Professor Chomsky praised Bronfman's work.
He's the person who worked for years with enormous courage and effort to try to expose what were called the secret wars. The secret wars were perfectly public wars, which the media were keeping secret. Government and Fred, this is in Laos, he finally did succeed in breaking through, and tremendous exposure of huge wars that were going on.
Fred Bronfman also worked in domestic politics, including as research director to California Governor Jerry Brown during Brown's earlier stint as governor in the late 70s and early 80s. Later in life, Bronfman committed himself to advocating a new human movement against climate change and to cultivating what he called a life-affirming awareness of death. Last month, in his final piece for the website Alternet, Fred Bronfman wrote about Israel's assault on Gaza by directly addressing Israel's supporters, asking, quote, "How do you justify your support for mass misery inflicted on hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians?" He continued, "I answered such questions for myself 45 years ago when I discovered that civilians were well over 90% of the victims of U.S. leaders' mass bombing of northern Laos. I concluded then that there is never any moral or legal justification for mass bombing or shelling of civilians, period," he said. Fred Bronfman died last Wednesday in Budapest, Hungary, where he shared a home with his wife, Sousa. He was 72 years old. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 10 years ago, 6 members of the U.S. military came together to break their silence over what they'd witnessed during the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. They band together and formed the organization Iraq Veterans Against the War. Over time, they gathered like-minded veterans across the United States to form a contemporary GI resistance movement. Each of the members has a personal story about why they joined the military, what they witnessed when deployed, and how they came to oppose the U.S.-led invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is Jose Vasquez, Executive Director of Iraq Veterans Against the War.
I grew up in a pretty tough situation in California. As a high school student, I felt like I didn't have a lot of options. The only person that was really actively reaching out to me was the Army recruiters. I had some experience with the military. My dad was drafted for Vietnam. My uncle served in the Gulf War. So for me, it seemed like this is something that the men in the family did. I was against the Iraq War from the beginning. I think in 2004, that was really a turning point for me when the Abu Ghraib scandal broke. One of my close friends who I served in the reserve with was deploying to Abu Ghraib, and so it really made it personal for me. It kind of brought the war home. For a while, I thought I was the only soldier that was opposed to the war, but I started doing research online, and I stumbled across Iraq Veterans Against the War. It was the only place where I heard the voices of soldiers and veterans who were speaking out against it.
That was Jose Vasquez, Executive Director of Iraq Veterans Against the War, or IVAW. The group just celebrated its 10th anniversary. They say it's a bittersweet moment as a decade later, the United States is back in Iraq. Today, IVAW members are in 48 states and numerous bases overseas. The group has called for reparations for the people of Iraq for both human and infrastructural damages caused by the U.S.-led invasion. They've also called for adequate health care, including mental health care, for all returning servicemen and women. Well, for more, we're joined by 3 of the members of Iraq Veterans Against the War. Kelly Doherty is the group's co-founder. She deployed to Kuwait and Iraq from 2003 to 4. Brock McIntosh is an IVAW member who served in Afghanistan from November 2008 to August 2009. He applied for conscientious objector status and was discharged in May 2014. And Scott Olson joins us, former Marine who served 2 tours in the Iraq War and was critically wounded, not in Iraq, but after being shot in the head by a police projectile at Occupy Oakland, where he was protesting. He was hospitalized in critical condition with a fractured skull, a broken neck vertebrae, and brain swelling. He, too, is a member of IVAW. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! I should say all back to Democracy Now!, since at one point or other we have had each of you on. Kelly, you're gathered here in New York for this 10th anniversary.
Yes, last night we had a 10th anniversary gala fundraiser, and it was a time for us to reflect on the work of the past 10 years. And as you said, it's bittersweet because we've been building this community to counter war, to counter militarism, and yet now here we are again bombing Iraq. So, you know, we're celebrating our victories and also recognizing the losses, both with war and militarism, and then losses within our own community. Of our friend Jacob George recently passed away.
And I want to talk about Jacob in a moment, but Brock McIntosh, what are your thoughts on the current bombing of Iraq and Syria?
Well, you know, I think the media has often portrayed ISIS as being some organization that just suddenly emerged over the last year or so, but this is the same exact organization that many of my allies in IVAW were fighting when they were in Iraq. And, you know, nearly 10 years of going to war with ISIS, with several 100,000 American soldiers on the ground, wasn't able to eliminate ISIS. So it's strange to think that some limited airstrikes over the next few years will be able to destroy ISIS. And reports from the FBI have shown that recruitment for ISIS has actually grown since we've started bombing them.
Scott Olson, how did you come to fight in Iraq?
Well, I joined the Marine Corps right after I graduated high school. You know, our country was at war. I felt like it was the right thing to do, to step up and to defend our freedoms and democracy.
Where did you grow up?
In Wisconsin. And right after I joined, I went to Iraq within about a year after I joined the Marine Corps. And that was in 2006, and I was in El Anbar province, where it's a majority Sunni population, which is where the Islamic State is making huge recruitment gains, and it's the population that they are recruiting.
And your thoughts right now on this renewed war in Iraq?
I mean, it's a renewed war, but it's really the same war. Just because we left, just because our military left, does not mean the war was over. You know, it's the same conflicts and the same tensions that we played a big part in stoking. And, you know, these are the consequences of war. You know, 10 years later, it's the same thing.
The most senior U.S. military officer has said U.S. ground troops may be needed in Iraq as part of the Obama administration's offensive against the Islamic State. General Martin Dempsey, chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee last month.
As I said in my statement, however, my view at this point is that this coalition is the appropriate way forward. I believe that will prove true. But if it fails to be true, and if there are threats to the United States, then I, of course, would go back to the president and make a recommendation that may include the use of U.S. military ground forces.
Kelly Doherty, your response to that?
Well, I find it just a little ironic that it seemed over the course of the Bush administration, the country really turned against the occupation of Iraq and wanted the troops to come home. And then last year, when we saw a proposal to bomb Syria, there was great opposition. But now, with all the fear-mongering that's been going on, it seems like just kind of overnight now a majority of people support bombing Iraq, bombing Syria, and even the idea of sending more troops back into Iraq, which just seems like a recipe for just continued long-term destruction and catastrophe, both for the U.S. soldiers involved and then for the people of Iraq who've been living generationally in war and conflict. I mean, so many of these fighters in ISIS now are people who were kids when I was in Iraq, you know, living in a constant state of disorder, violence, and conflict and occupation.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Our guests are Kelly Doherty, co-founder of Iraq Veterans Against the War, or IVAW, deployed to Kuwait and Iraq in 2003 and 2004. Brock McIntosh served in Afghanistan. Scott Olson twice in Iraq. They're all members of Iraq Veterans Against the War, celebrating their 10th anniversary as the U.S. goes back to war in Iraq. Stay with us.
Now I'm just a farmer from Arkansas. There's a lot of things I don't understand. Like why we send farmers to kill farmers in Afghanistan. Now I did what I was told for my love of this land. And I come home a shattered man with blood on my hand. And now I can't have a relationship, I can't hold down a job. Oh, well, some may say I'm broken by calling a soldier.
That's Jacob George singing Soldier's Heart. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Jacob George is an Afghanistan war veteran and peace activist who took his own life earlier this month. He co-founded the Afghan Veterans Against the War Committee, part of Iraq Veterans Against the War. In 2012, at the NATO summit in Chicago, he was among the veterans who hurled their military medals toward the summit gates in an act of protest against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
My name is Jacob George. I'm from the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas.
I'm a 3-tour veteran of the Afghan War, paratrooper and sergeant, and I have one word for this global war on terrorism decoration, and that is shame.
Jacob George killed himself September 17th, 1 week after President Obama unveiled a new U.S. military mission against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. He was 32 years old. Our guests are all members of Iraq Veterans Against the War. Scott Olson, Kelly Doherty, and Brock McIntosh. You knew him well. You knew Jacob George very well.
Yeah, we were good friends. We met a few months after I got back from Afghanistan. We co-founded the Afghanistan Veterans Against the War Committee with other veterans. And then a year after that, we went to Afghanistan again, but as civilians.
To do what?
Well, we met with a group called the Afghan Peace Volunteers, which has been doing wonderful organizing against the occupation of Afghanistan and organizing for an end to war in general in their country. And we also went to several schools, orphanages, and internally displaced persons camp. And Jacob has sung about those experiences in his recent album.
Can you talk about what happened to Jacob?
Sure. Jacob deployed to Afghanistan 3 times. His first deployment was in 2001, which was about 13 years ago. And
why did he go? Where did he come from?
Where did he come from?
Where did he grow up? Do you know?
Yeah, he grew up in Arkansas in the Ouachita Mountains. He was a very, very proud hillbilly. And returning to Afghanistan was a powerful experience for him because he got to meet Afghans who were also from the mountains of Afghanistan. They called themselves mountain boys, and he called himself a hillbilly. And you know, he and the Afghans he met talked about the unfortunate reality of sending farmers to kill farmers while people are starving, and there are several people starving in Afghanistan because of war for 30 years and drought.
And then can you talk about Jacob's struggles when he came back to this country?
Sure. He saw a lot of killing in Afghanistan, and he also talked about seeing fear in the eyes of Afghans, and the idea that he could put fear in someone kind of haunted him, and he had lots of nightmares when he returned, and felt kind of isolated and didn't really tell his story. But over the last few years, he's had the opportunity to tell his story and to build long-lasting relationships, not only with other veterans who are like-minded, but also with Afghans.
Jacob had this philosophy of what he called warriorhood. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So a soldier is a career professional, and they go to work and then they come home and they are able to compartmentalize the job of going to war and coming home. And a warrior is someone who being a warrior is a way of life, and they are driven by empathy. They see injustice and they want to do something about it, and they fight. But they also, that empathy isn't limited. They have empathy for the people that they're fighting as well, and that's part of what makes them good in battle. But that's also part of why they bring so much pain home, because they feel that pain and they begin to understand the enemy in a different way. Was he able to seek help from the VA, from the Veterans Administration, for post-traumatic stress disorder? I know that he had been seeing a counselor at the VA for some time, but he was having a lot of difficulty because this counselor would push back and sort of question him about whether or not he was right about his interpretations of war. He didn't believe that he had PTSD. He believed that he had moral injury, that it wasn't a disorder to feel the way that he felt about war, and that he was justified in being able to recognize that it wasn't moral, and to be able to tell people about that story. When we went out to Chicago to cover the NATO protest in 2012. That's when we covered so many of you who were throwing your medals back at the gate at the NATO summit. Jacob did that. We just played a clip of what he said as he hurled his medals. How important was that protest to him? I mean, he talked about how throwing that medal was like throwing his pain away. It was a symbolic moment. He believed a lot in rituals. And for him, that was sort of a ritual and a way of shedding that aspect of his identity.
Scott, I remember seeing you there with a helmet on. You wore a helmet for a long time after Occupy Oakland, after your head was hit by a police projectile. Can you talk about the VA and your experiences with it?
Sure. I first tried applying for health coverage from the VA, within months after I got out, and
after 2 tours in Iraq.
After 2 tours in Iraq, and I've now been out for almost 5 years, and I've yet to see a doctor from the VA.
How could that be?
Part of that's because I have what they call an other than honorable discharge, and that makes me ineligible to receive care from the VA. And there are thousands of veterans with an other than honorable discharge, and
how did that come about, the other than honorable discharge?
I was accused of using drugs in the military, and I didn't. And the process to award an other than honorable discharge is that there's no rights in terms of.
So you couldn't appeal what they decided.
Right. It was just 3 officers appointed by the battalion commander who made this decision, and there was no oversight and no way around it, really.
And once that decision is handed down, you cannot go through the VA system?
Well, after you get out, and I'm working on a process to get my discharge upgraded and for them to recognize the character of my service.
So explain what happened to you, not in Iraq, but at Occupy Oakland, and then the kind of health care you got after that, if you couldn't go to the VA.
Well, I ended up going to a private hospital.
What was the date that you were hit?
October 25th, 2011 is when I was shot by the police.
And you were there protesting because?
Mostly because I thought it was wrong that the police evicted Occupy Oakland from this public space in front of City Hall in Oakland. And I thought it was important to support Occupy Oakland as veterans and to say veterans support these rights that we thought we were fighting for.
And so explain what happened that night, not that you can really remember very much of what happened.
Well, the incident commander from the police gave the order to disperse.
Were you wearing your fatigues?
I was wearing my cami jacket, and I was standing next to another veteran in full uniform, and the officer gave the order to just deploy gas, and about 16 seconds after he gave that order, I was shot in the head by a beanbag round. It was their policy to protect tear gas canisters using beanbag rounds. So anybody who they thought was going to pick up and throw back a tear gas canister, they would shoot beanbags at them.
And so what happened to you laying on the ground? As you speak, we're also showing video of you at the time.
Another officer threw a flashbang grenade at myself and the people who were trying to rescue me and evacuate me. And this officer was terminated last year, and he was recently rehired with back pay.
And so you're being carried by people, they don't even know who you are. I remember seeing the video and them shouting, "What's your name? What's your name?"
Right, and I could not answer. And I didn't know I couldn't answer. I did not realize the extent of my injuries in those seconds. And when I couldn't answer them, that helped me accept that I was not doing well and I needed their help.
So you ended up not at the VA?
Right. I went to Highland Hospital, the public hospital in Oakland, and received care there. And I still have gotten zero care from the VA.
We're talking to Scott Olson, who sued the city, to explain what happened with your lawsuit. There was just a recent settlement.
Right. We settled in this past April for a total of $4.5 million.
And this was voted on by the Oakland City Council?
Right. They approved it. And it was through their city attorney's office that we arrived at that. And it's very good to have that lawsuit over. It was a very stressful period, but it's still not over. That the officer is still working for the Oakland Police, and Oakland Police still has poor disciplinary measures and processes.
And how are you feeling?
I'm not feeling good about Oakland Police or about going back into war, but I'm feeling ready to resist that and to keep fighting to right these injustices.
This issue of post-traumatic stress disorder and the return to Iraq and Syria, there's not a lot of discussion in the corporate media about the soldiers because, well, there's been this whole discussion of whether there will be boots on the ground. But the top generals are very much talking about that, not to mention those who fly what they call sorties, you know, who bomb Iraq and Syria. Can you talk about that? Soldiers who are not on the ground, but who are doing this, Brock?
Yeah, drone pilots and people who operate drones usually involve a team that involves about 4 or 5 different people, and they are not immune to being mentally troubled by their experiences in war. And you know, just to go back to what Scott was talking about, there are studies that show that soldiers who come home with PTSD are often more likely to commit crimes, and that means they're more likely to be dishonorably discharged. And in some ways, these are the people who need help the most from the VA.
Do you know what Jacob George's reaction was to the U.S. military going back into Iraq and now bombing Syria?
Well, I last talked to him in June, and at that time, ISIS was starting to take over Iraqi towns, and he was very troubled by the prospect of going to war. He was also equally troubled when Bo Bergdahl, the POW from Afghanistan, came home and not only didn't receive a welcome, but he received the opposite of a welcome. He received nothing but hatred.
I wanted to end by asking about the use of depleted uranium in Iraq. Last week, the Center for Constitutional Rights submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of Defense and the State Department on behalf of itself and Iraq Veterans Against the War. It seeks the firing coordinates of weapons used in Iraq that contain depleted uranium. If a person inhales, ingests, or is exposed to the radiation of depleted uranium, radioactive material can be absorbed into the lungs, bone, kidney, skeletal tissue, reproductive system, brain, and other organs. Kelly Doherty, you're one of the heads of IVAW.
Yes, so we've been working with the Center for Constitutional Rights and also with partners in Iraq, such as the Organization for Women's Freedom in Iraq, around issues of depleted uranium use. They're seeing in Iraq huge skyrocketing numbers of birth defects and health problems in areas where depleted uranium rounds were used. And then there's also the issue of returning veterans' health impacts and similar things. So we want to see where those weapons were used so we can start to build a case to support reparations for the Iraqis, as well as guaranteeing that our U.S. service members who are coming back with depleted uranium exposure get the proper recognition and treatment.
Finally, has Iraq Veterans Against the War come out with a statement on the U.S. bombing of Iraq and Syria right now?
We are working on a statement right now, and that should be out. And, you know, we've seen the human casualties of war, and these are inevitable consequences, is that more and more people are going to have their lives destroyed, and more people are going to be radicalized to join radical organizations like ISIS with our continued militarism in the region.
I want to thank you all for being with us. Kelly Doherty, co-founder of Iraq Veterans Against the War, Brock McIntosh served in Afghanistan, and Scott Olson, 2 tours of duty in Iraq, but was injured here at home when he was protesting at Occupy Oakland by the police. All members of Iraq Veterans Against the War. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Jeremy Scahill on Dirty Wars, The World as a Battlefield. Stay with us.
Take that yellow ribbon off your car. Take that waving flag off of your door. Don't act like you understand what we've been fighting for. Take that fake concern off of your face. Take that handshake and just move along. Stop appreciating me for all that I've done wrong, and take that yellow ribbon off your car. You think that I went to liberate, so when I come home you celebrate. But you can't bring back the dead by throwing a parade. You tell me I made my nation proud. I wish you wouldn't say it so damn loud. My boots were on.
Yellow Ribbon by Emily Yates, a member of Iraq Veterans Against the War. She says she wrote the song after speaking with fellow veterans about the yellow ribbon magnets people put on their cars. Yates was deployed twice to Iraq, where she served in the 3rd Infantry Division as an Army Public Affairs Specialist from 2002 to 2008. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Vice President Joe Biden said Thursday it'll take a, quote, hell of a long fight for the United States and its allies to stop the advance of militants from the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. But during the same speech, Biden admitted the Islamic State poses no existential threat to the nation's security. His comment comes as Australia becomes the latest country to join the U.S.-led fight. Prime Minister Tony Abbott said Australian planes will take part in the air campaign and that special forces would be deployed.
The Americans certainly have quite a substantial special forces component on the ground already. My understanding is that there are UK and Canadian special forces already inside Iraq. So we'll be operating on a much smaller scale, but in an entirely comparable way to the United States Special Forces.
Meanwhile, Turkey's parliament has authorized the government to order military action against the Islamic State. The mandate also allows foreign troops to launch operations from Turkey. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, ISIS militants have seized more than 350 North Syrian villages in the past 16 days, displacing at least 300,000 people. To talk more about the crisis in the Middle East, we're joined by Jeremy Scahill, who first reported from inside Iraq before the 2003 U.S. invasion. He's co-founder of TheIntercept.org and author of the book Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield. The paperback version of the book has just been published. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Jeremy, and congratulations on the book being published as a paperback. Talk about the war in Syria and Iraq now.
Well, you know, first of all, it's sort of like the terrorist flavor of the month that we're dealing with here. You know, first we had Al-Qaeda is this huge global threat. Then it was ISIS. And then the Khorasan group, you know, was produced. And the thing is, almost no one in Syria had ever heard of the Khorasan group. In fact, my understanding is that it was a term that was sort of used in the U.S. intelligence community and actually isn't the name of the people that they claim to be attacking. And what the entire policy boils down to is that the Obama administration has, in a very Orwellian way, changed the definition of commonly understood terms, primarily the term imminent. They are saying that the Khorasan group represented an imminent threat to the United States. But we know from a leaked white paper that was put out in advance of John Brennan's confirmation to be the CIA director, that the Justice Department actually has officially changed the definition of the word imminent so that it does not need to involve an immediate threat against the United States, that it could be a perception that maybe one day these individuals could possibly attempt to plot, not even carry out, a terrorist attack against the United States. That flimsy justification has been used now to expand this war from Iraq to Syria, potentially beyond. You know, the Obama administration, in engaging in this policy, is continuing a Bush administration outcome of the decision to invade Iraq, and that is they're empowering the very threat that they claim to be fighting. Who is ISIS? What is this group made up of? Is it just people that are radical Islamists that want to behead American journalists? No. One of the top, and this almost is never mentioned in corporate media coverage of this, one of the top military commanders of ISIS is a man named Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri al-Takriti. Who is Izzat Ibrahim? Izzat Ibrahim is the leading Ba'athist who was on the deck of cards that the United States has not captured. He was one of Saddam Hussein's top military commanders. He was not just some ragamuffin Ba'athist. He actually was a hardcore general in the Iraqi military during the Iran-Iraq War, and he was a secular Ba'athist. Why is he fighting with ISIS? Well, when Bush decided to invade Iraq, and then he put Paul Bremer, who was a radical neocon ideologue who had cut his teeth working for Henry Kissinger, when Paul Bremer was put in charge of the occupation of Iraq, one of the first things he did was to fire 250,000 Iraqi soldiers simply because they were members of the Ba'ath Party. As one senior U.S. official at the time said, it was the day we made 250,000 enemies in Iraq. All of these Ba'athists have been jerked around by the United States, and the Sunnis in western Iraq jerked around by the United States for a very long time. There was the period of the so-called surge where the U.S. actually paid Sunnis not to kill the United States, U.S. soldiers, but then the U.S. turned around and put in power a Shiite-led government under Nouri al-Maliki that effectively operated a network of death squads that systematically attacked Sunnis. So the point I'm making here is, yes, there's an element of ISIS, I don't know how dominant it is within the group, that is trying to establish the caliphate. And they are beheading people, and they are imposing a very strict interpretation of Sharia law. But there are also, and I would suspect that they're best military figures, there is also a large contingent of people that are fighting the same battle that they were fighting when the United States originally invaded. The fact is there was no al-Qaeda presence in Iraq before George W. Bush made the decision to invade it, except in the Kurdish region in the north of Iraq, which was not under Saddam Hussein's control. In fact, it was under the control of U.S.-backed entities, and that was Ansar al-Islam. Saddam Hussein's forces were fighting that group. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying is that the United States, through its policies, created the very threat that it claims to be fighting now. And in continuing this policy, what President Obama is doing is embracing the very lies that made the Cheney-Bush Iraq War possible. And in the process, he's creating yet another generation of people in the Islamic world who are going to grow up in a society where they believe that their religion is being targeted, where they believe that the United States is a gratuitous enemy. And so this is sort of an epic formula for blowback.
According to Yahoo News, the Obama administration's acknowledged a policy announced last year calling for near certainty for no civilian casualties in drone strikes will not apply to the current bombing. The admission came in response to queries about a strike that killed up to a dozen civilians in the Syrian village of Kafr Daryan last week. Right.
I mean, this is kind of kabuki drone theater here, because the reality is that even in their drone strikes that are supposedly done with precision and every precaution is taken not to kill civilians, the reality is that they've created a mathematical process for churning out the number of civilians killed in drone strikes that will always result in zero. Because if they kill a so-called jackpot, the target that they're aiming for, and they kill other unknown individuals, the system that the Obama administration, the U.S. military, and the CIA have developed is that anyone who is an EKIA, enemy killed in action, is someone who we don't have proof that they're innocent. In other words, it's sort of a reversal of the idea that you're innocent until proven guilty. If you are near someone that the U.S. was intending to kill, the presumption is that you are an EKIA, you're an enemy killed in action, unless someone can prove that you weren't. And I mean, most of these drone strikes we don't know anything about. So in a way, the fact that they're saying this, it has actually very little meaning, except that they're going to have even less regard for civilian lives than they already do through their kabuki theater with their existing drone program.
Let me ask you about former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, the book that's coming out, Worthy Fights. He writes, in the fall of 2011, it was clear to me and many others that withdrawing all our forces would endanger the fragile stability then barely holding Iraq together. To this day, I believe a small U.S. troop presence in Iraq could have effectively advised the Iraqi military on how to deal with al-Qaeda's resurgence and the sectarian violence that's engulfed the country.
I mean, this is a clown show with these guys. I mean, the fact is that Leon Panetta was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency and had enormous influence at that point. The fact that the Obama administration adopted what was effectively the U.S. policy in Iraq when Bush left office says a tremendous amount about how little the Obama administration understood the disaster in Iraq. Had the United States kept in in this this sort of strike force, which would have been CIA paramilitaries, special operations forces, it would have exacerbated the problem. The problem here isn't whether or not the U.S. forces would have been there to stabilize Iraq. The issue is how much worse are we going to make Iraq with these policies? And I think it's almost impossible to imagine that this could have been handled in a worse way. Having more troops there, I mean, that's all of these guys, when they write their memoirs, have this brilliant 2020 vision looking backwards, that they were the one that knew, they would have done this differently. The U.S. basically since 9/11, and you could make an argument that this has been U.S. policy for many, many decades. U.S. policy has been its own worst enemy in one sense. We've created the very threats we claim to be fighting. But on the other hand, if you actually look at who benefits from this war, beyond entities like ISIS, because they do benefit from this. Every time we kill civilians in drone strikes, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula becomes stronger in the sense that they have a greater propaganda movement that they can roll out. The war industry. Lockheed Martin is making a killing off of the killing. Every Tomahawk cruise missile that's launched, the next generation of drone aircraft is going to be coming out. They're working on jet-propelled drones that are going to be able to stay in the air for a very long time. The war industry is in its twilight right now under Mr. Transformative Presidency Barack Obama. His administration has been an incredibly great friend to the war industry. And outside of some small groups of loony bins that are in Syria and Iraq, the war industry is the greatest beneficiary of this policy.
ISIS killing the journalists and the beheadings.
Yeah, I mean, this is, first of all, this has haunted me a lot. I mean, obviously, as a journalist who's worked in those areas, and I have a lot of friends now who are in those countries. I was horrified at it. In watching the videos, though, they were so, in both the case of James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, they're so calm in the statements that they are giving, and it's impossible to imagine that they know that they're going to be killed in those moments. And my suspicion, and I've done some reporting on this, is that they had been put in that position repeatedly and told, you have to say this statement. And in other words, they were subjected to mock executions over and over and over again. So, and if you notice in the videos, you don't actually see their heads being cut off. I think it's possible that that was like read number 31 for James Foley of this statement, and they took the best cut of that. And he may have been killed in another context, and then they placed it there. They have them in the orange jumpsuits. We know that they had been waterboarded. Where does this come from? This was inspired by what we did to Muslim prisoners around the world when we put them in gulags in Poland and Thailand and elsewhere in these so-called black sites, when we took them to Guantanamo or we threatened their family that we were going to kill their families, or we put them in small boxes where they couldn't lay down and couldn't stand up, and we brought in psychiatrists to, in a very sick, macabre way, investigate and exploit the fears of the Muslim prisoners that we took under the auspices of fighting terrorism, and we would stick people in boxes, and if they had a fear of spiders, we'd put a caterpillar in the box and tell them it was a tarantula to try to terrify them. JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, ran a torture factory in Iraq at a camp called Camp Nama, which is nasty ASS military area, where they were just torturing people, trying to find the next target to hit. These militants are adopting the very tactics that the United States used and continues to use against Muslims that it captures. And there has never been a more intensely dangerous time for journalists. On the one hand, you have episodes like this where journalists are being beheaded. In Mexico, journalists are being gunned down by narco cartels or pro-government forces for telling the truth and reporting. Freelancers and mostly Arab or Muslim journalists are on the front lines being killed in record numbers in Somalia as well. And then here at home, in the United States, there's a war against journalists and a war against whistleblowers. The U.S. government is intent on tracking who is giving information to journalists that is not officially cleared by the White House. And the message that they're sending is we only want the official statements to be out, or our official leaks. When the Khorasan group popped out of nowhere, and we're told, like, this is the greatest threat. In fact, on NBC News, there was a fantastic Brian Williams, when he was announcing the new latest greatest threat trademark. He had a graphic next to him that just said "the new enemy." And it's like, we could just take a picture of that, and every year, or apparently now it's going to be every 2 or 3 months, we can just have Brian Williams there with the new threat. It could become an annual holiday in this country where we just celebrate whatever new war is going to give Lockheed Martin and Boeing and all these companies tremendous profits. The age that we're living in now, where there's this war on journalists abroad by every possible force, and then this war at home where journalists are being surveilled, their sources are being threatened with prosecution under the Espionage Act. The Obama administration is in league with some of the most ruthless violators of human rights in the world in a campaign against the press.
President Obama, the current president, possible presidential contenders, for example, are Hillary Clinton. You wrote Dirty Wars while she was Secretary of State. What about her position on this? I mean,
Hillary Clinton is, I actually think, is more hawkish than Barack Obama. And Barack Obama has emerged as a pretty significant hawk in terms of his policies. He can talk all he wants about, how he wants to change and reset relationships around the world. This has been a total militarized presidency. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, acted as though she was also sort of Secretary of Defense, and her State Department was deeply involved with plotting covert action around the world, using the State Department as cover for CIA operations. And the Clintons Bill and Hillary Clinton are two of the most fierce projectors of the politics of the American empire, and they also have very close relationships with some of the most nefarious characters from the Bush family. So those two families together, the Bushes and the Clintons, it's almost like a monarchy in this country. I mean, Jeb Bush very well may run. I mean, it's unclear what George W. Bush said the other day, that he's putting pressure on his brother to try to run for president. But Hillary Clinton is a fierce neoliberal who believes in backing up the so-called hidden hand of the free market with merciless, iron-fisted military policies.
Let me ask you very quickly about Blackwater and the trial that's been going on. Jurors have been deliberating in the murder and manslaughter trial of the 4 former Blackwater operatives allegedly involved in the 2007 massacre at Baghdad's Nisour Square. The suspects are charged with the deaths of 14 of the 17 Iraqi civilians who died when their Blackwater unit indiscriminately opened fire.
Right. I mean, this was the worst massacre of Iraqi civilians at the hands of mercenaries, private contractors that we know of in Iraq. And I don't know how the verdict is going to turn out, but what I do know is that the person who should be on trial is Eric Prince, who was the founder and ran Blackwater when it was essentially Murder Incorporated in Iraq, where there was an environment at that company where they were encouraged to view every Iraqi as the enemy, and they committed many massacres beyond what we know at Nisour Square. This is a microcosm of what happens all the time. It's always the people down the chain that face the consequences. I believe that these men should be prosecuted, should be convicted for what they did, and they should be in prison. But the leadership of Blackwater should also be there. And until we as a society stop cutting off who's held accountable at the lowest ranks, nothing is ever going to fundamentally change.
Jeremy Scahill, thanks so much for being with us. His new book, Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield, well, the New York Times bestseller, is now out in paperback, and that does it for the show. Congratulations to our colleagues. Heartfelt congratulations to our former producers, Maddie Harper and John Hamilton, on the birth of their daughter, Jasmine Cynthia Harper. Happy birthday, Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman.